Hello sewing and non-sewing friends. In this video I am going to be talking about different ways that you can reduce the seam bulk. So when you're sewing, as in examples that I'm going to have, most times you might have a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, or you can have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So the first example is going to be just trimming your seam allowance. So we're going to say this is the shoulder seam. So you actually press your seam open on both sides. And then just to trim your seam allowance, what you would do is just take your seam allowance and cut off half. I'm not the best at cutting, but there it is. So that is one way to reduce your seam bulk. That's going to be a hard word for me to keep saying. Seam bulk is to just trim it. Okay. The next example, and oh, before I forget, so this is what you would do for lightweight to medium fabric. So this is 100% cotton. So that would be a very that would be a correct way to trim your seam bulk. The next example is going to be if you were using something heavier. So we're going to pretend that this is some wool or some really thick knit like sweater material. What you do not want to do is trim your seam allowance, because you might have a shorter seam allowance, but it's going to be thick right here. So the other option is called layering. So the first thing you would do is first you would trim both seam allowances in half, and then you would take, so if this was the shoulder seam, and you're going to press your seam allowance towards the back of your shoulder seam. So the bottom layer will stay as is, and then this top layer, you will cut that down even further. And again, I do a horrible job at cutting. And so this is now a layered seam, and the longest layer goes at the bottom, so that you have a nice gradual curve to your shoulder. So that's how you would, and this is for straight seams. So that's the second option, is to layer your seams. The next one is clipping. So we're going to pretend that this is the curve. This is going to be your neck curve. And so we talked about before how, you have all this material. This is the previous video about making sharp corners. You have all of this material in here, and it's not going to go. So what you will need to do is you would clip your curves. Snip up to, but not through my stitching line. No, I'm just going to go ahead and it is quite fine to take your time, because you do not want to cut your stitches. So this is called clipping, and what this does is that it gives some room in here, so that when you go ahead and you fold everything and flatten it, I don't have my iron on at the moment, but hopefully you'll get the idea. So I'm going to go ahead and get the side done. Okay. So there you have a nice curve. So I'm going to go ahead and lift it up so you can kind of see what is going on in here. See how everything spreads out? So you're releasing that tension so that things can lie straight. And so at this point, if this was a collar, and this was going to be the outside of the collar, you would understitch along here, but that's a topic for another video. So that is an example of clipping. The next example for reducing seam bulk is notching. So now on this example, we have a curve, an outside curve. The other one was an inside. This is an outside curve. And notching are just little V-shaped cuts in your seam allowance. And I'll go slow. I do not want to cut through, even though this is an example. So one thing I do is I do all of my snips one way. I have to get my scissors oiled. There's some hesitation in there. Okay. And then I take it and then I cut off. It relieves a little tension in the seam line. So notches, they're small V-shaped wedges that are cut out of the seam allowance on an outward curve. And so when you go ahead and press your seam, and if you kind of like look in there, you can see that it just gives it some room. So your seam is able to lie nice and flat all the way around. So those are the 4 examples for reducing seam bulk. The first one is trimming. The second one was layering. And then on this one here for inside curves, this is clipping. And for outside curves, notching. So thank you, and if you enjoy my videos, please like and subscribe and share. I'd greatly appreciate it. Thanks for watching. Loves!